She had built an empire worth billions, boardrooms, headlines, a name that made grown men straighten their ties. But on a rain-flooded mountain road in the dead of night, Celeste Armitage stood soaking wet beside a dead SUV, completely alone. And the man who stopped to help her had no idea he was about to tear open the one wound she had spent 15 years making sure no one would ever find. Because hanging from his rearview mirror was something that should not have existed. Something she recognized the moment the truck's dome light hit it. A compass. Scratched silver. Tied with a faded crimson thread. Her hands went cold before she even understood why. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the very end, because what's coming will shake you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain had been falling since early afternoon, and by 9 o'clock it had turned into something meaner, the kind of rain that didn't come straight down but sideways, hard and relentless, drumming against metal and glass like it had a personal grievance with everything underneath it. Gavin Harlow drove with both hands on the wheel. His pickup, a 2009 Ford F-250 that had survived 2 transmission failures, a cracked engine block, and what Gavin privately considered an unreasonable number of bad decisions, moved through the mountain road with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had learned not to fight things he couldn't control. The wipers worked double time and still barely kept up. The defroster had stopped working sometime in March, and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it, which meant he was wiping the inside of the windshield with a rag every few minutes. He was tired in the deep structural way that didn't go away with a night's sleep. The repair job in Colton Ridge had run long. A diesel engine rebuild on a logging truck that the owner had conveniently failed to mention had been jury-rigged with the wrong grade of bolts for at least 2 years. Gavin had discovered this at hour 4 of what was supposed to be a 2-hour job, kneeling in someone's gravel driveway in the dark with a flashlight clenched between his teeth, thinking about the leftover soup on the stove at home and whether Mrs. Paulette across the hall had remembered to check in on Sadie. He'd texted her twice. She'd responded both times with the same message. "She's fine, Gavin. We're watching something on TV. Eat something before you drive back," which he appreciated more than he ever said out loud. The fuel gauge hovered just above the E. There was a station at the bottom of the mountain, 11 miles out. He was going to make it, but not with anything to spare. He almost didn't see her. The SUV was pulled half off the road onto a gravel shoulder that barely qualified as such, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. Gavin spotted the amber flash first, then the dark silhouette of a person standing beside the rear of the vehicle. Not hunched, not cowering, just standing there in the downpour with the posture of someone who hadn't yet decided how bad the situation was. He slowed. His first instinct, trained into him through years of operational work in environments where stopped vehicles were sometimes the beginning of something much worse, was to assess. Not paranoia. Just the habit of a man who had learned the cost of not looking twice. One person, visible, no other figures near the tree line. Hazard still running, which meant the battery wasn't dead. The vehicle was a late-model Range Rover in a color he couldn't quite make out in the rain. Dark, expensive, the kind that cost more than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. He pulled over. He left the truck running and grabbed the spare jacket from behind the seat, an old Carhartt that smelled like motor oil and had a tear at the left elbow that he kept meaning to sew, and got out into the rain. She turned when she heard his door. She was younger than he'd expected. Maybe late 20s, maybe 30, with dark hair plastered flat against her face and a wool coat that had been elegant about 20 minutes ago and was now just soaked expensive fabric. She was holding her phone to... Screen cracked, he noticed, and looked at him with an expression he recognized. Not fear exactly, but the careful, measuring look of someone deciding very quickly how much to trust a stranger. Gavin held up both hands, jacket in one of them. "I'm not going to bother you," he said over the rain. "Just saw the hazards. You need help?" She looked at the phone, then at him. "It died," she said. "The car. Not the phone. The phone died too, but the car went first." She said it with a flatness that struck him as oddly composed for someone standing in the middle of nowhere in a rainstorm. "What happened?" "I don't know. It just stopped. I was driving and then I wasn't." Gavin walked to the front of the Range Rover and she followed him, which told him she wasn't entirely unreasonable. He tried the hood release from the outside. It didn't respond. He looked back at her. Keys? She handed them over without argument, which was the second sensible thing she'd done. He popped the hood from inside, lifted it, and shone his flashlight into the engine bay. The rain made it difficult, but he could see enough. Serpentine belt, he said. It's gone. That fixable? Not here. Not tonight. You'd need a tow. He glanced up at her. You got roadside? I don't know. This isn't my car. He didn't ask whose it was. Wasn't his business. Closest town with a service station that'll be open is Delbridge, about 9 miles down the mountain. I can take you there. He looked at the phone she was still holding. You able to make calls on that? It turned off. I can't get it back on. He thought for a moment, in the way he thought about most things, quickly and without theatrics. All right, come on. I'll take you down. She hesitated. Not long, maybe 3 seconds. But he noticed it. He was the kind of man who noticed things that took 3 seconds when people expected them to take one. It wasn't suspicion, he understood. It was intelligence. A woman alone on a mountain road at night, accepting a ride from a stranger in a beat-up truck. The hesitation was the appropriate response. My name's Gavin Harlow, he said. I live in Delbridge. I'm a mechanic. I've got a daughter at home, and I want to get back to her. I'm not going to do anything except drive you down the mountain. She looked at him for another moment. The rain hammered everything. Celeste, she said. Just the one name. Okay. He handed her the Carhartt jacket, which she took and pulled on over her ruined coat. It hung off her shoulders by a wide margin, but she didn't seem to care. He locked the Range Rover with her keys and put them in her hand, then walked back to the truck and held the passenger door open. She climbed in. The cab of the pickup was warm in the way that old vehicles got warm. Not efficient, not even, but real. The heater had its own particular sound, a faint metallic tick that Gavin had long since stopped hearing. The radio was off. On the back seat, a child's backpack in yellow canvas sat propped against the door, covered in iron-on patches of various sizes. A son, a dog, the state of Tennessee for reasons Gavin had never fully gotten out of Sadie. Beside it, a folded drawing on loose-leaf paper, rendered in the enthusiastic and technically ambitious style of a 9-year-old who had recently discovered that colored pencils existed. Celeste settled into the seat and pulled the jacket tighter around herself. Gavin pulled back onto the road. For a while, neither of them said anything. The rain filled the silence adequately. He drove the way, he drove everything, steadily, reading the road ahead, not performing calm but actually being it. There were curves on this section of mountain that required real attention, places where the shoulder dropped away into nothing, and the guardrails were old enough to be optimistic rather than functional. He was several miles down when he became aware that something had changed in the passenger seat. It was the breathing. In another life, a life he had spent considerable effort distancing himself from, Gavin Harlow had been trained to read rooms, read people, read the weight and rhythm of human behavior in environments where misreading it could get you and everyone around you killed. He had tried, in the 5 years since leaving the Navy, to let most of that go. It wasn't useful to him now. It wasn't a skill that served a man who fixed engines in a small town and packed school lunches and attended 4th-grade parent nights. But some things don't entirely leave. Celeste had shifted. Not physically. She hadn't moved much. But the quality of her attention had changed. She was looking at something, not through the windshield at the road, at something in the cab. He glanced sideways without turning his head. She was looking at the rearview mirror, more specifically at what hung from it. It was a compass, small, palm-sized, the casing scratched silver with age and use, the kind of compass that had been carried, genuinely used, and returned to a pocket so many times that the edges had worn soft. A piece of faded crimson thread looped through the ring at the top, tied in a knot that someone had made carefully and replaced at some point, because the original had frayed through. Beside it, smaller, hung a photograph in a protective plastic sleeve, wallet-sized, showing a young woman smiling at the camera in a way that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable having her picture taken, but was making an effort. Gavin noticed that Celeste had gone very still. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. The word came out automatic, the way words did when people said them without running them through the question. He gave her a moment. She was still looking at the compass. "That bother you?" he asked. She pulled her eyes away from it with what seemed like genuine effort. "No," she said. "Sorry, I just—" She stopped. "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. He'd spent too long reading people in tight spaces to mistake nothing for something. But he didn't push. He turned his eyes back to the road and let the rain fill the cab again. Celeste sat with her hands in her lap, the knuckles laced together in a way that wasn't casual. She looked at the yellow backpack on the back seat, at the drawing folded beside it. Then slowly, her eyes went to the dashboard, to the small photograph tucked behind the cup holder, held in place by a rubber band that had been there so long it had started to harden. A woman in the photograph, brown-haired, laughing, her head tilted at an angle that made it look like someone had just said something ridiculous, and she had loved them for it. Then back to the compass. The color in her face had changed, not dramatically, not the kind of thing most people would have caught. But Gavin caught it. Something in the angle of her jaw, in the muscles beneath her eyes. She recognized something. He didn't know what. He didn't know her. Had never seen her before in his life. She said her name was Celeste, and that was everything he had. But something in his cab had reached into her and grabbed. "The compass," she said finally. Her voice was careful, like someone choosing a path across ice. "Where did it come from?" Gavin checked the side mirror out of habit before answering. "It belonged to my wife." A pause. "Your wife," Celeste repeated. "She passed 5 years ago." He said it the way he always said it, directly, without apology or the slight upward inflection that invited condolences. He had found, in 5 years, that delivering it cleanly was the kindest thing for everyone involved. "I'm sorry," Celeste said quietly. "Thank you." "Did she—" Celeste stopped herself, started again. "Do you know where she got it?" Gavin looked at the compass without touching it. "She said she'd had it a long time," he said. "She told me once that it came through some information she'd tracked down, about her family, her biological family. She was adopted." He paused. "She spent a long time trying to find where she came from. She never said much about what she did or didn't find. I think she got the compass somewhere along the way." In his peripheral vision, he saw Celeste turn toward the passenger window. He let her have whatever she needed. The rain kept coming. The heater kept its metallic tick. The mountain road kept curving, falling, opening ahead of them in the sweep of the headlights. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Gavin drove and said nothing, because there are certain silences that have weight, and you don't fill those with talk. You carry them. You give them room. He didn't know yet what he was carrying. He wouldn't know for a while. But something in the cab of his battered pickup had changed in the space of a single question, and Gavin Harlow, a man who had walked through things that would have broken most people, and had rebuilt himself slowly and imperfectly in the aftermath, drove through the storm with a stranger beside him who was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The compass turned slowly at the end of its crimson thread. The lights of Delbridge appeared far below, scattered and small and yellow through the rain, like something someone had dropped and not bothered to pick up. Gavin thought about Sadie, asleep by now, or pretending to be, which she did sometimes when she heard the truck pull up, so she could listen to him move through the house and know he was home. He thought about the soup on the stove, cold now. He thought about tomorrow's work order and whether the new socket set he'd ordered had come in yet. He did not think about the compass. Not yet. Beside him, Celeste pressed her hands flat on her knees, and the woman who ran one of the largest corporations in the country and had spent 15 years building herself into someone who didn't flinch, sat quietly in a mechanic's truck and stared at the rain coming down. The lights of Delbridge came up slowly through the rain, the kind of small-town glow that looked almost gentle from a distance. A smear of amber and white against the wet dark. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself. Gavin took the last curve off the mountain road and the grade leveled out, and suddenly they were on flat ground again, the rain still coming but the worst of the elevation behind them. He pulled into the lot of the only gas station in town that kept late hours. A Sunoco with 2 working pumps and a fluorescent sign that buzzed like it was in pain, and parked under the overhang out of the rain. "There's a phone inside," he said. "Landline. Buddy of mine owns this place. He'll let you use it. You can call a tow, get a hotel room sorted. Nearest decent one is the Delbridge Inn on Cartwright, about 6 blocks. He paused. "Or whoever you need to call." Celeste hadn't moved. She was still looking at the compass. "Hey," he said it quietly, not unkindly. "You with me?" She turned. Her eyes were dry, but they had that particular tightness around them that he associated with people working very hard at something internal. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry." "Yes." She reached for the door handle and then stopped. Her hand stayed on the lever, and she sat like that for a moment, not going anywhere. "The compass," she said again. She wasn't looking at it this time. She was looking at the dashboard, at the little photograph rubber-banded behind the cup holder. "You said your wife was adopted." "That's right." Did she ever find anything about her biological parents?" Gavin was quiet for a moment. There was something in the question that he couldn't quite locate. Not suspicion exactly, more like recognition. The feeling of a door you've passed 100 times suddenly being on the wrong side of the wall. "She found some things," he said carefully. "Not everything she was looking for." Celeste nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something she already suspected. "Come on," Gavin said. "Let's get you inside." He topped off the tank while she used the phone, standing at the counter near the register while his friend Denny pretended not to listen and mostly succeeded. Gavin paid for the gas and a cup of coffee he didn't particularly want and leaned against the hood of his truck under the overhang, watching the rain bounce off the empty parking lot. He could see her through the glass. She had her back to him, one hand pressed flat on the counter while she talked. Whoever she was calling, the conversation was short. She hung up and stood there for a moment with her hand still on the phone, her head slightly bowed, before she straightened and turned around and came back outside. "Tow truck is coming in the morning," she said. "First available." "And tonight?" "I'll find a room." She handed him the Carhartt jacket, and he took it. "Thank you for stopping. You didn't have to." "No," he agreed. It wasn't false modesty. He was just stating a fact. She looked at him for a moment in the buzzing light of the gas station, rain dripping from the overhang between them, and something crossed her face that he couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly, something older and more complicated than gratitude. "The Dell Bridge Inn," she said. 6 blocks up Cartwright. Turn left on Milner. Signs lit up. She nodded, didn't move. "You're going to walk?" he asked. "I don't have many other options." He looked at the rain. He thought about Sadie, asleep in the apartment. He thought about how he was tired in every part of himself, and how he had an early job tomorrow, and how there was no version of his life in which driving a stranger 6 blocks out of his way was a significant inconvenience. "Get in," he said. "I'll drop you." She looked like she was going to argue, then didn't. She got in. The 6 blocks took 4 minutes. He pulled up in front of the inn, which was not glamorous but was clean and warm-looking and had its parking lot light working, which Gavin considered a reasonable baseline for a place to spend the night. He put the truck in park. "Good night," he said. She opened the door. Rain came in briefly. She stepped out and then paused, her hand on the door frame, and turned back. "Gavin," she said, "your wife's name." He waited. She seemed to think better of it. "Good night," she said. "Thank you." She closed the door and walked into the inn without looking back. Gavin sat there for a moment in the idling truck, alone in the rain, looking at the door she'd gone through. He sat there longer than was strictly necessary. Then he put the truck in drive and went home. He got back to the apartment at 10:43. Mrs. Paulette had left a note on the kitchen table. "She's asleep, ate all her dinner, asked about you twice," and a Tupperware container with the leftover soup reheated and covered with foil. Gavin ate it standing at the counter in the dark because he was too tired to sit down, and turning on the overhead light felt like a commitment he wasn't ready to make. He checked on Sadie. She was asleep on her side with one arm hanging off the mattress in the way she'd slept since she was an infant, a habit Gavin had eventually given up trying to correct. Her hair was across her face. The nightlight on her dresser cast everything amber. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he did most nights, just to confirm, just to see her breathing and her arm hanging off and her face soft in the way that faces got when they didn't know anyone was watching. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about the compass, the way it had turned on its thread, and then he told himself to stop thinking about it and went to sleep. He didn't hear from Celeste the next morning. He went to work, replaced a water pump on a Silverado, diagnosed a carburetor issue on a lawn tractor that someone had for some reason driven to his shop on the street, and had lunch at his bench because he didn't have time to go anywhere. He thought about the woman from the mountain road in the vague, peripheral way you thought about strangers you'd helped and would never see again. Not dwelling, not curious, just the faint residue of an unusual night. She showed up at 3:15. He was under the Silverado when he heard the shop door open. He rolled out on the creeper and found her standing on the other side of the lift, still in the ruined wool coat, carrying a paper coffee cup from the place on the corner. She'd dried out since last night. She looked, he noticed this without entirely meaning to, like someone whose default setting was composed and precise, the kind of person for whom the wet mountain road version had been a significant departure. "The tow's coming at 4, she said. I wanted to ask you something." Gavin sat up on the creeper. "Okay." She looked around the shop for a moment, at the tools hanging on the pegboard, at the job orders clipped to the board by the door, at the photograph of Sadie taped to the corner of his workbench, the one from her first day of 3rd grade, backpack on, expression indicating she found the whole tradition of first-day photographs somewhat beneath her. "Your wife," Celeste said. "What was her name?" He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. "Marielle," he said. "Marielle Harlow. Marielle Voss before we married." Something happened in Celeste's face. It was small. It was the kind of thing that happened in the space between one expression and the next, in the instant before a person reassembled themselves. But he caught it. "Can I show you something?" she asked. She set down the coffee cup and reached into her coat pocket and produced her phone, the cracked one, plugged back to life at the hotel, presumably. She brought up a photograph and held it out. It was a picture of a young man, maybe 23, 24, dark-haired, strong-featured, standing in front of what looked like an open-engine bay, wiping his hands on a rag the way mechanics always did. He was smiling at the camera with the uncomplicated ease of someone who didn't spend much time worrying about how they looked in photographs. Gavin looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I took it," she said. "A long time ago." He looked up at her. "That's Elias," he said. She didn't answer immediately, but her jaw shifted just slightly, and that was answer enough. Elias Harlow. Gavin's older brother by 4 years, which would have made him 23 or 24 in that picture. A man who had been a mechanic, who had dreamed about opening his own shop, who had been, and this was the thing Gavin had known without ever fully understanding, someone's whole world for a period of time, and then wasn't. Elias had died 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and without negotiation. The kind of illness that gave you just enough time to get your paperwork in order, but not much else. He had died unmarried, without children that anyone knew of, in a hospital bed in Hartwell, with Gavin sitting next to him and their mother on the phone from Tucson because she couldn't get a flight out in time. Gavin set down the rag. "You knew my brother," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Celeste said. He waited. She looked at the photograph on her phone screen, then turned it face down in her palm. We were together, for almost 2 years, a long time ago." She paused. "Before you would have known about me. He never mentioned you." "I know." Her voice was even, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "I left. I didn't give him a chance to mention me to anyone. I was just gone." She looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." The shop was quiet. Outside, the rain had dropped to a drizzle, and the light through the high windows was gray and flat. Somewhere down the street, a truck rumbled past. Gavin leaned back against the lift column. "Go ahead." Celeste had grown up in the kind of poverty that didn't get romanticized, the variety that was simply grinding and relentless, and that wore people down not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of things not having and doors not opening, and the particular exhaustion of watching other people live in a different world that didn't seem to notice yours existed. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a younger brother who needed more than either of them could reliably give, and she had understood from a young age that the only exit from that particular life was through a door she'd have to build herself. She was smart. She had always been smart. The kind of smart that teachers noticed and sometimes helped, and sometimes, because teachers were people and people were complicated, resented slightly. She had gotten scholarships. She had worked. She had finished a business degree in 3 years and started a master's program. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, at 21 years old, she had met Elias Harlow. He was fixing her friend's car in a parking lot. She had made a joke about something. She couldn't even remember what now. And he had laughed, and that was how it started. The way most things started, with something small and sideways and impossible to prepare for. She didn't tell Gavin any of the good parts. Not then. She wasn't ready to put words to the good parts in front of someone who had a right to be angry. What she told him was this. She loved his brother. She had loved him with the full and terrifying completeness of 21 years old, and she had also, simultaneously, been terrified by it. Terrified that she would choose him and stay, and the life she had been building and fighting for would slowly become something she had to apologize for wanting. She had been offered a position, an internship that was really a door at a company in another city, the kind of opportunity she had been working toward for years. It was everything she'd aimed at, and it required leaving. She did not tell Elias she was going until she was already most of the way out the door. She was 22 years old, and she told herself that she would explain it properly later, that she would call when she was settled, that she would find a way to make him understand. She told herself those things the way young people told themselves things that were almost certainly not true. She never called. She stood in Gavin's shop and told him this without decoration, without the kind of framing people used to make themselves look less culpable than they were. She had left his brother. She had made a choice, and she had left. Gavin listened. He was not a man who interrupted. He had learned, in the kind of situations where interrupting could get people killed, to wait until a person was finished before he responded to anything. He stood against the lift column with his arms crossed, and his face doing very little, and he listened. 3 months after I left, Celeste said, I found out I was pregnant. The shop got quieter. I was 22, she said. I was 3 months into a job that I had sacrificed everything I could afford to sacrifice to get. I was living in a studio apartment that I could barely pay for. I had $2,400 in savings and a mother I didn't want to call because she would have come, and that would have meant losing another thing, and She stopped. Started again. I told myself I wasn't in a position to raise a child. I told myself that a child born into that situation deserved better than what I could give. I told myself a lot of things. She looked at the phone, face down in her hand. I had a daughter, she said. I gave her up for adoption when she was 4 days old. I signed the papers and I left the hospital, and I never told Elias. I never told anyone. I spent the next 15 years building a career in a company and trying not to think about a decision I couldn't unmake. Gavin had not moved. His arms were still crossed. His face was still doing very little. But something behind his eyes had shifted in a way that Celeste felt rather than saw. The way you felt a change in air pressure before it became weather. The compass, he said. His voice was level. Why did you react to the compass? Celeste looked at the rearview mirror of the truck, still visible through the shop window. Because Elias had one exactly like it, she said. Same size, same scratching along the left edge, same kind of ring at the top. She paused. He carried it everywhere. He told me his grandfather had given it to him. He said it was the only thing of value he'd ever owned that actually meant something. Her voice had gotten quieter. When I saw it hanging in your truck, I thought I was imagining it. I thought... She stopped. I thought maybe you'd taken it from his things after he died. Or that it was a coincidence. Gavin uncrossed his arms. He walked past her to the workbench and stood there with his back to her for a moment, looking at the photograph of Sadie taped to the corner. Then he turned around. Marielle's compass, he said, came through a private investigator she'd hired. She'd been trying to find information about her biological family for years. She never told me exactly what she found. She was private about the search. She didn't want to get my hopes up for her or get upset in front of me and Sadie. But she told me she'd made contact with someone, some intermediary, and that she'd been given an object that had belonged to her biological father. He paused. She never said who the father was. She said she was still trying to find the mother. He watched Celeste's face as he said it. She had gone very still. Marielle Voss, he said slowly. Born where, do you know where the adoption was filed? Hartwell, Celeste said, and her voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. The hospital in Hartwell. That's where she was born. Hartwell. Where Elias had lived. Where Elias had died. Where Gavin had sat beside his brother's hospital bed and watched him go with the quiet devastation of a man who had learned, by that point, to survive things that should have ended him. The silence in the shop was a different kind now. Gavin put both hands flat on the workbench and looked at the photograph of his daughter. His 9-year-old daughter, with her backpack and her deadpan expression and her iron-on patches and her colored pencil drawings taped to the dashboard. "Marielle's birthday," he said. It came out strange. "When's the birthday on the adoption papers?" Celeste told him. Gavin closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to get his breathing somewhere manageable. He opened them. "That's Marielle's birthday," he said. Neither of them spoke. The drizzle had stopped outside and the gray light through the high windows had gone flatter, late afternoon flat, the specific quality of light that happened in the hour before dark when the sky couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "She looked for you," Gavin said. He said it quietly, without inflection, and that made it worse somehow than if he'd said it loudly. "She spent years looking for you. She hired people to find you. She wrote letters she never sent because she didn't have an address. She had a box under our bed for 3 years. I found it after she died, full of notes and printouts and things she'd saved from the search. She never said anything to me about it because she didn't want to burden me while she was sick." His voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. But something in the quality of the air around him changed. "She died not knowing who you were." Celeste had one hand pressed over her mouth. Gavin had watched people receive terrible news in a range of circumstances. He had delivered it himself, more times than he wanted to count, in more difficult contexts than this. He knew what it looked like when something arrived in a person that they hadn't been built to hold. "I need you to go," he said. Not harshly, not cruelly. Just the way a man said something when he knew that the alternative was saying things he couldn't take back. "I need you to go now. The tow truck's coming, and you should be there." Celeste lowered her hand. Her eyes were dry, but only just. "I know," she said. She picked up the coffee cup from where she'd set it on the corner of the bench. She put her phone in her coat pocket. She walked to the door of the shop and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Her name," she said, without turning around. "Her name was... It's what I called her, before I signed the papers. I called her something in my head, and I never told anyone." She stopped. "I don't know if she ever found that out. I don't know if the agency passed it along." Gavin waited. "I called her May," Celeste said. Something moved across Gavin's face, because Marielle had gone by May. Her whole life, from the time she was small. The family, her adoptive parents, her friends, had all called her May. She had never known why the name had felt right. She had simply always preferred it, the way people preferred things they didn't have explanations for. Celeste walked out of the shop without looking back. Gavin stood at his workbench in the gray late afternoon light and did not move for a long time. Then he picked up the photograph of Sadie from the corner of the workbench, carefully, the way you picked up something that mattered, and held it. The shop was quiet. Outside, a car went past. A dog somewhere down the block barked twice and then stopped. Gavin set the photograph back against the workbench exactly where it had been. He reached up and turned off the work light. He sat down on the stool in the dark shop, and he put his face in his hands, and the former Navy SEAL who had survived things that men were not supposed to survive sat alone in the quiet and gave himself exactly the amount of time he allowed himself for things like this, which was not very long but was real, and then he straightened up. He had a daughter to pick up from school. He had food to make and homework to help with, and a bath to argue about because Sadie considered bathing an affront to her personal sovereignty and always had. He had a morning job order to prep for and a call to return and 37 other unremarkable things that made up the architecture of a life, and none of them had changed. He put on his jacket. He turned off the shop lights. He got in the truck. The compass turned on its thread when he started the engine, just slightly, catching the last light of the afternoon in its scratched silver face, and Gavin looked at it for a long moment before he put the truck in reverse and backed out into the street. He thought about Marielle, about the box under the bed that he'd found and opened and sat with on the floor for 2 hours, and then carefully closed and put in the closet, because he hadn't known what else to do with it, and throwing it away had not been something he was capable of. About the letters she'd written and never sent, full of handwriting he would have recognized anywhere, to a person she never found. He thought about a 22-year-old woman in a hospital in Hartwell, sitting alone with a choice she wasn't equipped to make, signing papers because she believed it was the right thing, and probably also because she was afraid. and how both of those things could be simultaneously true, and how neither of them made the outcome less broken. He thought about his daughter. His 9-year-old daughter, who was somewhere in an elementary school 4 blocks away waiting for him, who had never asked about any grandmother other than the one who sent birthday cards from Tucson and video called on Christmas, who drew pictures of dogs she didn't own and astronauts she intended to become and stuck them everywhere. He thought about what a person did with information that had arrived too late for the people it most belonged to. He didn't have an answer, not yet. He drove to the school. Sadie was waiting on the front steps with her yellow backpack and her expression of mild, well-practiced impatience, which she deployed whenever he was more than 4 minutes late, and which he had, privately, always found funny in a way he never told her. "You're late," she said when she got in. 4 minutes. That's still late. Technically. She pulled the backpack onto her lap and looked at him sideways. "You okay?" Kids notice things, he'd learned. Not the things you thought they'd notice. Not the big obvious ones, but the small calibrations. The slight shift in expression, the half-second delay before a normal response. Sadie had been noticing those things in him since she was 5 years old, because she was his daughter, and because she was, beneath the deadpan exterior and the chronic lateness complaints, paying attention. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at him for another second, deciding whether this was worth pursuing. Then she looked out the window. "Mrs. Callahan gave us a project on ecosystems," she said. "I want to do wetlands, but Tyler Marsh says he already picked wetlands, and he didn't." "Did he actually pick it?" No, he just wanted to pick it because I said I wanted it." "Can you both do wetlands?" She said no. "What did you tell him?" Sadie paused. "I told him he should pick something else because he doesn't know anything about wetlands, and I've been interested in them since 2nd grade. Gavin drove. "And?" "He's doing the tundra now." "Problem solved." "I didn't bully him," she added, somewhat defensively. "I didn't say you did." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the truck window, Delbridge moved past in the gray dusk. The laundromat, the hardware store, the corner lot where someone had been trying to build something for 18 months and appeared to have given up without announcement. "Dad," Sadie said. "Yeah." "Were you crying?" He glanced at her. She was looking at him with the direct, unhurried assessment of a person who had decided to simply ask the thing she was thinking. "No," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the window and did not push it further, which was, he thought, both the best and hardest thing about her. He pulled into the lot behind their building. He got out and waited while she wrestled the backpack on, and then she fell into step beside him, and they walked through the low evening light together, the former Navy SEAL and his daughter, across a parking lot that had 2 broken lights and a crack down the middle where a weed was doing its stubborn best. The compass was still hanging in the truck, turning slowly, the way it always had, pointing at nothing in particular, and somehow, always, pointing home. 3 days passed. Gavin went to work. He fixed things. He picked Sadie up from school and made dinner and helped with the wetlands project, which had grown into something considerably more ambitious than Mrs. Callahan had probably intended when she assigned it, involving a hand-drawn map of North American marsh systems and a list of 17 species of migratory birds that Sadie had decided were all personally important to her. He washed dishes and paid the electric bill online and replaced the bathroom faucet that had been dripping since January, and he moved through all of it with the steady, deliberate functionality of a man who had learned that staying in motion was the closest thing to okay that most days offered. He did not call anyone. He did not look anything up. He did not open the closet where Marielle's box sat on the second shelf behind the extra blankets, in the spot he had put it 4 years ago when he'd found it and hadn't moved it since. On the 4th day, Celeste called him. He didn't know how she got his number. He suspected Denny at the Sunoco, who was constitutionally incapable of withholding information from a woman who asked him directly for it. He picked up on the 3rd ring because he was under a car and had to roll out to reach the phone, and by the time he got to it, he'd already missed the first 2. "It's Celeste," she said. He sat up on the creeper. "I know." A pause. "I'd like to talk to you, not on the phone." He looked at the undercarriage of the Buick above him and thought about several things at once, quickly and without arriving at any particular conclusion. "Right," he said. They met at a diner on the edge of town called Rudy's, which was not remarkable in any way except that it had good coffee and booths with high backs that gave you privacy without making you feel like you were hiding. Gavin got there first and took a booth near the back. He ordered coffee and did not look at the menu because he had been coming to Rudy's for 4 years and had never needed the menu. Celeste came in 7 minutes later. She was dressed differently today, still expensive but quieter about it, a dark coat and simple clothes that didn't announce themselves the way her wool coat had. She looked like she hadn't slept particularly well, which he found more honest than if she'd looked fine. She slid into the booth across from him. The waitress came and she ordered coffee too, black, and then they sat across from each other in the high-backed booth with the sounds of the diner moving around them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I owe you more than I gave you in the shop," she said finally. "You don't owe me anything." "That's not what I mean." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, which had just arrived, and looked at him. "I mean, I wasn't finished. I stopped because you needed me to stop. But there are things you should know. Things about what I've been doing. For a long time." She paused. "Can I tell you?" He looked at her across the table. In the diner light, she looked different than she had in the truck. In the rain, where the dark and the storm had put everyone at a disadvantage. She looked older, in the sense that the composure she'd had in the truck had layers under it now that he could see. Exhaustion, and something that had been sitting in her chest for a very long time and was only recently being allowed to take up its actual amount of space. "Go ahead," he said. After she left Elias, after she left Hartwell, after she signed the adoption papers and walked out of the hospital and took a bus back to the city with a bag that felt too light and a body that felt wrong in every possible way, Celeste had done what she'd told herself she was going to do. She had worked. She had worked with the focus and the drive and the particular ferocity of someone running from something, which she had been, and she had not allowed herself to think too carefully about the difference between ambition and flight. She was good at her job. She was better than good. She moved up, moved again, moved laterally when moving up wasn't fast enough, and somewhere in the decade following the worst choice she'd ever made, she had built something that people in boardrooms discussed in the kind of language that meant significant. She became the CEO of Armitage Group at 31. The company bore her name because she had built it, literally, from a 2-person consulting firm she'd started in her late 20s. It was a real estate and infrastructure development company that had grown into something considerably broader, with divisions she sometimes forgot existed until they showed up in quarterly reports. She was good at it. She was very good at it. And she had spent 15 years being very good at it and telling herself that the life she'd built was the proof that the choice she'd made had been necessary. She had started looking for her daughter 6 years ago. She said this quietly, across the diner table with her coffee mug between her hands, and Gavin went very still. 6 years ago, she told him. She'd hired a private investigator. Not the company kind, not the transactional kind, who ran database searches and billed by the hour, but someone who had been personally recommended by someone she trusted, a woman who specialized in closed adoptions from the late 90s and early 2000s. It had taken 8 months before there was anything concrete to look at, and then what there was had been complicated by the fact that the adoption had been handled through an agency that had since merged with another agency, and the records were incomplete in several ways. But there had been a name. Marielle Voss, adopted at 4 days old by Thomas and Diane Voss of Kellner County. The investigator had found that much, and then the trail had gotten difficult in the way that trails sometimes got difficult when the person you were looking for had become someone else's life, and had grown up and moved and changed and built their own history that didn't include you. She found Marielle's name, Celeste said, and then she found that Marielle had married, Harlow. And she found an address in Delbridge, and She stopped. "I was trying to figure out how to make contact. I was trying to figure out what you said to someone in that situation, what you led with. I wrote drafts. I threw them away. I hired someone to help me think through the ethical dimensions of it, which sounds ridiculous, and it was ridiculous, but I did it because I was terrified of doing it wrong." She put the mug down. "And then the investigator called me and told me that Marielle had died, that she'd been gone for 5 years, that I'd been looking for someone who—" She stopped again. The muscles in her jaw worked briefly. "I was too late. By 5 years. By more than that, really." Gavin looked at the table. There was a long silence that neither of them filled. "After that," Celeste said, "I stopped looking. For about a year. I stopped everything related to it. And then I started again because I thought there might be family, people who knew her, people who might be willing to tell me who she was. Her voice had gone quiet and direct. I found out there was a daughter, a granddaughter. I found out there was you, and I'd gotten that far and I didn't know what to do with it. And I was coming over the mountain road to Delbridge 3 nights ago because I'd found your address, and I'd talked myself into at least driving past it, at least seeing where you lived, and then the car died, and she gave a short, flat sound that wasn't quite a laugh. And you stopped. Gavin looked up at her. Of all the people on that road, she said, you stopped. He sat with that for a moment. You were going to drive past my house, he said. I know how that sounds. I'm not judging the logistics. He picked up his coffee. I'm trying to understand what you wanted, what you were actually hoping for. She was quiet for a moment. I wanted to see something real, she said. I wanted to see something that proved she had been a real person who had a real life, and that it had been good, that she hadn't spent her whole life feeling abandoned. She looked at him. I know that's not something you could give me. I know that's not how it works. But that's what I was hoping for when I drove over that mountain. Gavin put the cup down carefully. He was doing the thing he did when he needed to manage what was happening inside him. The deliberate, almost mechanical quality of movement that had kept him functional in circumstances that were, by any rational measure, significantly worse than a diner booth in Delbridge. It didn't make him cold. It made him slow, careful. A man taking the time to be sure he knew what he was going to say before he said it. She had a good life, he said. She was a good person. She was funny in a specific dry way that caught you off guard. And she was stubborn about things that didn't matter and flexible about things that did. And she was a good mother. He paused. She never felt abandoned, as far as I know. She felt curious. She felt like there was a part of the story she didn't have. That's different. Celeste looked at him with something that was past gratitude, something that didn't have a simple name. And the searching, he continued, wasn't about grievance. I don't think. I think she genuinely just wanted to know. She was a person who wanted complete information. That was Marielle. She sounds like... Celeste stopped. What? Nothing. I was going to say something self-serving. Say it anyway. She looked at her hands on the table. She sounds like she knew how to go after what she needed, even when it was hard, even when it took years. She paused. That's not a trait she'd have gotten from Thomas and Diane Voss. No, Gavin said, it isn't. They sat with that for a moment. It was Gavin who asked, then, the question that had been sitting in him since the shop, since the moment Celeste had said the name Hartwell, and something in the room had shifted. He asked it quietly and without preamble. Do you have the adoption records? Celeste reached into her coat and produced a folded envelope. She set it on the table between them. She didn't push it toward him. She just put it there. He looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then he picked it up. Inside was a single document, not the full file, just the registration page, the one with the dates and the parties listed. Gavin read it slowly. He read the date of birth, which matched. He read the hospital, which was Hartwell Memorial. He read the birth mother's name, which was listed as Celeste Marie Armitage, 22 years old. He folded it back up and put it in the envelope. I need to show you something, he said. Not here. She looked at him. Now? Tomorrow. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. Come to the shop at noon. Bring whatever you have, whatever documents, whatever photographs, whatever the investigator gave you. She nodded. He picked up the check before she could reach for it, which seemed to surprise her. He left cash on the table and slid out of the booth. Gavin, she said. He stopped. I'm not trying to buy my way into anything, she said. I know that's probably a concern, given who I am and what resources I have. I know how that looks. He looked at her. I know, he said. I know you're not. He left the diner and drove home through the November dark and thought about the envelope in his jacket pocket, and thought about Marielle's box in the closet, and thought about how sometimes the things that arrived too late for the people they belonged to had to find somewhere else to land. The next day, Celeste came to the shop at noon. Gavin had locked the front and put the closed sign up, which he almost never did in the middle of a workday, and which cost him approximately 4 hours of potential work that he couldn't really afford to lose. He didn't think about that. He thought about it later, briefly, and then he stopped thinking about it because there were certain ledgers that didn't balance in money, and trying to make them do so was a waste of time. Celeste came in carrying a briefcase. Not a corporate briefcase, not the hard-sided kind that announced itself, but a worn leather satchel that looked like it had been used for years and had the dents and scuffs to prove it. She put it on his workbench and opened it. She took things out carefully and set them down. There were photographs. There were documents. The investigators' reports, the records from the agency that had handled the adoption, a birth certificate that had the hospital's stamp from Hartwell Memorial in the upper right corner. There was a manila envelope she set aside without opening. Gavin had brought the box from the closet. He had not opened it since the night he'd found it, almost 4 years ago. He had carried it out from the bedroom that morning with the same feeling you got when you picked up something heavy that you'd been stepping around for a long time, the surprise of its actual weight, and the slight shame that you'd left it sitting there so long. He set it on the workbench across from Celeste's materials. He opened it. Marielle's handwriting was immediately, violently present. He had forgotten, somehow, or not forgotten, but not been prepared for the way it hit when you weren't braced for it. The particular slant of her letters, the way she pressed too hard with the pen and left slight ridges on the back of the page. The box was full of it, notes in the margins of printed documents, lists, dates circled and question marks written next to them. Pages of a composition notebook filled with her careful, slightly too compressed handwriting. He did not read any of it. He couldn't. Not yet. But he set the box on the workbench and he stood back and he let Celeste look. She looked for a long time. She didn't touch anything without asking, and he noticed that, and it mattered to him. She leaned over the box and looked at the pages, at the documents, at a photograph near the top of a young woman he recognized as the nurse who had worked at the agency that Marielle had tracked down. She looked at dates. Her lips moved slightly as she read, calculating something. Then she picked up the manila envelope she'd set aside. "I need you to look at this," she said, "but I need you to be ready for it." He looked at her. "Show me." She opened the envelope and took out a photograph. It was not the original. It looked like a scan, printed on good paper, the kind of quality that came from a high-end printer. She turned it over and placed it on the workbench facing him. It was a photograph of Celeste. Young Celeste, 21, maybe 22, standing outside somewhere, squinting slightly in bright light, her hair shorter than it was now, and standing beside her with his arm around her in the easy, uncalculated way of someone who had not yet learned to calculate these things, was Elias. Gavin looked at his brother's face for a long time. He had not seen a photograph of Elias in, he didn't know how long. He had somewhere. He knew where they were. He just didn't look at them often, because looking at them did something to his chest that he didn't have time for on most days. Elias was laughing in the photograph. He was laughing at something outside the frame, and the laugh was completely authentic. Gavin would have known it anywhere. The particular way Elias laughed when something actually got him, slightly too loud, his whole face involved. "He looks happy," Gavin said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "He was," Celeste said quietly. "He was very happy then." Gavin nodded once and looked away from the photograph. He picked up one of Marielle's composition notebooks from the box. He opened it to a random page, not to read, just to hold it, to be in the same physical space as something she had made. Then Celeste reached into the satchel again and produced one more thing. It was not a document. It was not a photograph. It was a small card, the kind that came with flowers, the stiff cream-colored kind, barely larger than a business card. She set it on the workbench between them. On it, in handwriting he didn't recognize, careful, slightly formal, the handwriting of someone trying to be precise, was written, "For May, when she's ready to know. The compass belonged to your father." Gavin picked up the card. He read it twice. "Where did this come from?" he said. "The investigator found it," Celeste said. "It was with the compass when it was transferred. Whoever sent it, whatever intermediary Marielle had been working with, they included that card." She paused. "I think Marielle knew. Or she was close to knowing, close enough that someone trusted her with the compass and that note." Gavin set the card down. His hands were steady. He had made his hands stay steady in worse situations than this, and his body remembered how, even when the rest of him was somewhere less reliable, but there was a pressure behind his sternum that had been building since yesterday in the diner and was now at a level that required management. She knew about the compass, he said. She knew it came from her father, but she never said his name to me. She never confirmed whose it was. Maybe she hadn't confirmed it yet, Celeste said. Maybe she was still trying to connect the last piece. Gavin looked at the card, looked at the box, looked at the photograph of Elias laughing in the sun beside a young woman who would spend 15 years running from the decision she made the year that photograph was taken. "Tell me about her," Celeste said. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "Tell me something real about her, not the important things, just something real." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the composition notebook in his hand. He thought about Marielle, not the version of her that existed in grief, the preserved and careful version, but the actual version. The version that left dishes in the sink and got unreasonably invested in local elections, and had an extremely specific opinion about how towels should be folded that she somehow managed to hold simultaneously with not caring about most things. She couldn't parallel park, he said. In 4 years of living in this town, she never once parallel parked successfully on the first try. She'd go around the block 4 times rather than parallel park, if there was any other option. She thought it was a design flaw in roads. He paused. She also corrected people's grammar in her head, but almost never out loud, because she said the world had enough to worry about. Another pause. She made Sadie's Halloween costumes by hand, every year, even when Sadie wanted something specific and complicated and clearly designed to make the handmade version impossible. Marielle figured it out every time. She'd stay up until 2 in the morning, and she wouldn't let me help, and by the end of it, she was furious and proud in equal parts. Celeste was looking at him. "She sounds like someone worth finding," she said. "She was," he said. "She absolutely was." The shop was quiet around them. And then Gavin's phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Sadie's school, the specific number, the main office, which was different from the nurse's office, which was different from the emergency number, and his body responded to the distinction the way it always did, with a quick, cold assessment that was over in under 2 seconds. Main office. Not an emergency. Probably administrative. He picked up. "Mr. Harlow?" It was Mrs. Denning, the school secretary, whose voice he recognized. "Nothing urgent. I just wanted to let you know that Sadie's been asking about you. She said you were supposed to bring something for the ecosystem presentation today." He closed his eyes briefly. The laminated marsh map, which was sitting on the kitchen table at home, where he had left it this morning because he had been thinking about Marielle's box and had walked out of the apartment with his coffee and his keys and nothing else. "I'll bring it," he said. "Give me 40 minutes. No rush. Presentations aren't until 2. He hung up. Celeste was watching him. "Go," she said. "I'll be back." "No. Go. Take care of what needs taking care of." She began, carefully, putting her materials back in the satchel. She did not take anything from Marielle's box. She did not touch any of it without permission, which she had not been given. "I'm staying in town for a few more days. I'd like to continue this, if you're willing." She zipped the satchel. "On your terms. On your schedule. I'm not going anywhere." Gavin looked at her. He thought about trust, which was a thing he thought about carefully and didn't distribute carelessly. He thought about what it meant to assess someone's actions versus their words, which was a habit that had served him well and which told him, right now, that Celeste Armitage was doing something real. She wasn't performing. She wasn't managing him. She was just there. In his shop, with her documents and her 15 years of wait, asking for something she didn't have any particular right to and doing it without pretense. "I have to ask you something," he said. She looked up. "When you found out Marielle had died," he said, "your first instinct, was it to keep searching or was it to stop?" She didn't answer immediately, which he respected. She thought about it. "Both," she said. "At the same time, for about 6 months I couldn't decide which one I was doing." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to know what brings you here," he said. "Whether it's guilt or whether it's something else." She was quiet for a moment. "Both of those things too," she said. "I'm not going to tell you it's pure. It's not pure. I feel guilty every day, and I have for 15 years, and that doesn't go away when you find out it's even worse than you thought." She met his eyes. But I have a granddaughter, a 9-year-old child who is the daughter of a woman I gave away and never found in time. And I don't know how to be in the world and know that and do nothing about it. Gavin looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his jacket from the stool. I'll be back in an hour, he said. Don't touch anything in the box, but you can look. He left her there. He drove to the apartment, went in, picked up the laminated marsh map from the kitchen table, where it sat between a coffee cup and a permission slip for a field trip he'd already signed. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the apartment, at Sadie's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, at the shoes she'd left exactly where he'd told her not to leave them, at the crack in the windowsill he kept meaning to caulk and hadn't. He thought about what Celeste had said. A 9-year-old child who is the daughter of a woman I gave away and never found in time. I don't know how to be in the world and know that and do nothing about it. He thought about what Marielle would have said. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. He'd thought about it enough times in the last 3 days to know that he didn't have clear access to what Marielle would have wanted, because Marielle had been complicated and private about this particular search and had never once told him what she hoped for at the end of it. He had assumptions. He didn't trust assumptions in situations that mattered. He picked up the laminated map. He drove to the school. Sadie was in class, which meant he dropped the map with Mrs. Denning at the front office and signed the field trip permission slip while he was there, and on his way back to the truck he passed the hallway with the 4th grade artwork on the walls. The student paintings and drawings arranged in a long, dense gallery along the corridor. He slowed without meaning to. He found Sadie's immediately. He always found hers immediately, even in a crowd of 30, because her style was distinctly her own. Very little sky, very much ground-level detail, the kind of art that ignored what things were supposed to look like from the outside and went straight for what interested her. The current piece was a wetland, obviously, rendered in brown and green and blue, with more biological accuracy than most 4th graders managed. And in the corner she had labeled individual plants in her compressed, too serious handwriting. At the very bottom of the painting, almost as an afterthought, she had drawn 2 figures, small, simple, standing at the edge of the water. One was clearly meant to be her, the other was slightly taller and held something small and round in an outstretched hand. He looked at that second figure for a long moment. He didn't know what she'd meant it to be. Probably just a generic adult. Probably just compositional. He went back to his truck. He drove back to the shop. Celeste was where he'd left her, sitting on the stool near the workbench, not touching anything, with her satchel on her lap. She looked up when he came in. "How's the marsh project coming along?" she asked. And it was such a normal question, such an unpretentious and ordinary thing to ask, that it did something to the air between them that neither of them commented on. "She's been at it for 2 weeks, Gavin said. He hung his jacket back on the hook by the door. "She knows more about wetland ecosystems than I do." "What does she want to be?" He looked at her. "This week? An astronaut. Last week it was a marine biologist. The week before that she was fairly seriously considering a career as a cartographer because she found out cartography was a real profession." Something happened in Celeste's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, warm and involuntary, the kind of expression that happened before a person decided whether to let it happen. Gavin sat down across from her on the second stool, the one he used when he was working through a diagnostic problem and needed to sit with it for a while. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up at her. "Tell me what you're actually asking for," he said. "Not what you think I want to hear. What you actually want." She looked at him steadily. "I want to meet her," Celeste said. "Someday. When and if you decide that's possible. I'm not asking for it now. I'm not asking for a schedule or a plan. I just want you to know that it's what I'm hoping for." She paused. "And in the meantime, I want to tell you things about Marielle's father that she should know. Things she deserves to know, that nobody else can tell her, because Elias is gone and I'm the only one left who knew him." Another pause, smaller. "If you'll let me." Gavin sat with that. He thought about trust. I thought about what it cost and what it built, and how you couldn't get to the second thing without risk of the first. He thought about Sadie, drawing wetlands and astronauts, and 2 small figures at the edge of the water. He thought about Marielle's compass, turning on its thread in the truck outside, scratched silver and worn soft at the edges from decades of being carried and handled and kept close by people who valued it more than most things they owned. He thought about what it meant that the compass had found its way. Through Elias, through the adoption, through years of searching, through a dead SUV on a rain-soaked mountain road, back to his truck, back to Delbridge, back to the daughter of the woman who had spent years looking for where it came from. And then other things happened, and sometimes the sequence had meaning, and sometimes it was just sequence. But he sat in his shop across from a woman who had made a terrible choice at 22 years old, and had spent 15 years carrying it, and had come over a mountain in a rainstorm trying, in some incomplete and probably doomed way, to start doing something different. And Gavin Harlow, who had survived things that should have ended him and had come home and rebuilt a life and raised a daughter alone in a town that was small enough to be kind and large enough to leave you alone, made a decision. Not a large one. Not an announcement. Just a door. Just slightly open. Sadie has a school presentation on Friday, he said. The wetlands thing. Parents are invited. He looked at Celeste. There'll be a lot of people there. She won't know who you are. You'd just be someone I know, who came. Celeste sat very still. Are you sure? She asked. No, he said, but I'm doing it anyway. She nodded once. She didn't say thank you, which was the right instinct. Thank you would have been too small for what he'd just offered, and they both knew it. Gavin stood up and turned the shop light back on. I've got a water pump to finish, he said. You should probably get some lunch. Celeste picked up her satchel and stood. She walked to the door of the shop. This time she didn't pause at the frame. She just looked back at him once. Just a look, direct and unadorned. And then she walked out into the gray November afternoon. Gavin picked up his tools. Through the high window of the shop, pale light fell across the workbench, across the open box, across the composition notebooks full of Marielle's handwriting and the documented record of a search that had ended too soon. The card still lay on the corner of the workbench. For May, when she's ready to know. The compass belonged to your father. Gavin picked it up and put it in the box, carefully, between the pages of the top notebook. Then he went back to work. Friday came the way Fridays came in November, gray and unhurried, with a cold that had settled in overnight and hadn't been persuaded to leave by morning. Gavin dropped Sadie at school early because she had asked him to, wanting extra time to arrange her display materials before the other kids arrived, and she had spent the entire drive there holding the laminated marsh map in her lap and reviewing the species names under her breath like a student preparing for an oral exam, which was essentially what she was doing. Gadwall, she said. Gadwall blue-winged teal, northern pintail. You know these, Gavin said. I know them. I'm just making sure I still know them. There's a difference? She gave him the look she gave him when she considered a question beneath engagement and went back to her list. He dropped her at the front entrance and watched her go in through the glass doors, backpack, marsh map, the slight forward lean she always had when she was walking somewhere with purpose, and sat in the parking lot for a moment after she disappeared inside. He thought about Celeste. He hadn't called her since Tuesday at the shop. She had texted him once on Wednesday. A single line, no elaboration, still in town, no pressure on Friday. Your call. He had read it and not responded immediately, which was his way of sitting with a decision rather than making it reflexively. And by the time he'd decided that his response was going to be the same answer he'd already given her in the shop, it had been late enough that sending a text felt like a production. He hadn't sent one. He assumed she'd come. He assumed correctly. She was already in the school gymnasium when he arrived at 1:15, standing near the back wall with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the display tables with the careful, contained attention of someone trying very hard not to do anything that drew notice. She'd dressed down. Jeans, a dark sweater, the kind of flat shoes that suggested she had thought about this. No jewelry beyond small earrings, no briefcase. She looked, as much as a woman like Celeste Armitage could look like anything other than herself, like someone's aunt who had come to see a presentation. Gavin walked over to her. She's at the third table from the left, he said quietly. Celeste found Sadie without difficulty. Sadie was standing beside her display board, which was considerably more elaborate than most of the surrounding projects, involving the laminated map, a typed species list, and 3 separate hand-drawn diagrams of water filtration processes that she had decided were important context, and was explaining something to 2 other students with the focused intensity of a person who had not considered the possibility that her audience might be less interested than she was. She looks like... Celeste stopped herself. Like Marielle, Gavin said. A pause. Yes. She does, he said. She's got her mother's way of talking to people. Like she's explaining something that should be obvious, but she's willing to be patient about it. Celeste made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. She kept her eyes on Sadie. The presentation started at 1:30. Each student had 4 minutes at the microphone, which the school had set up on a low platform at the front of the gym, and a timer that Mrs. Callahan managed with the serene authority of a woman who had been doing this for 22 years and was immune to both chaos and cuteness. Sadie was 7th. Gavin stood near the middle of the gym with the other parents. Celeste stayed near the back wall. He checked on her once, a quick look over his shoulder, and found her watching Sadie with an expression he didn't try to interpret because it was too layered and too private and it wasn't his to read. When Sadie got to the microphone, she didn't look nervous. She looked like she was at the beginning of something she'd been waiting to do, which was how she looked when she was comfortable. She put her notes on the podium. She had notes, 3 index cards, though she barely glanced at them. And she started talking about wetlands. She talked about carbon sequestration and water filtration. She talked about biodiversity and migratory patterns, and the specific way a wetland could absorb a flood that would otherwise devastate the surrounding area. She talked about it with the conviction of someone who had come to this information personally and cared about it genuinely, and she ran 11 seconds over her 4-minute limit, and Mrs. Callahan let her finish her sentence before she stopped the timer. Gavin clapped with the other parents. He looked back at the wall. Celeste was clapping too, her hands moving steadily, her face doing something complicated that she wasn't controlling as carefully as she probably thought she was. After the presentations, there was the usual gymnasium milling, parents finding their children, children performing the social gymnastics of being simultaneously proud and mortified by their parents' presence, teachers receiving compliments with the professional warmth of people who would prefer everyone just went home. Gavin found Sadie at her display table. "You went over," he said. "I had more to say. Mrs. Callahan let you finish." "Because I was making a good point." She began rolling up the laminated map. "Did you think it was good?" "I thought it was very good." She looked at him sideways to assess whether this was genuine or parental automatic, apparently decided it was genuine, and went back to the map. "I want to do it again next year on riparian zones," she said. "They're related but different. I think most people don't understand the distinction." "Probably not." "I could do a 2-part presentation. You'd have to clear that with Mrs. Callahan." "She'll say yes. She always says yes to things that are educationally motivated." He watched her roll the map and thought about what he was about to do, and thought about whether he had thought about it enough, and decided that there was a point past which additional thinking was just delay dressed up as caution. He had been a man who made decisions under conditions of incomplete information for most of his adult life. This was no different. "Hey," he said. "There's someone I want you to meet." Sadie looked up. She scanned the gymnasium with the quick, unsentimental assessment she applied to most situations. "Who?" "A woman I know. I know, she's standing near the back." He paused. "She knew your grandfather." Sadie went still. Not dramatically. She went still the way she went still when something required her full attention, which was a quality she had gotten from Marielle, and which Gavin recognized every time he saw it. "My grandfather," she said. "Which one?" "My brother, Elias." He paused. "Your mother's biological father." The gymnasium noise continued around them, parents and children, and the scraping of folding chairs and Mrs. Callahan's voice somewhere near the door. Sadie stood at her display table with the rolled marsh map under her arm and looked at her father with an expression he couldn't entirely read, which happened more rarely than it used to, and happened more often than he was prepared for. "Mom's biological father," she repeated slowly. "So that would make this woman—" "It's complicated," he said. "But yes, in a way." Sadie looked toward the back of the gymnasium. She found Celeste without him pointing, just scanned the room, and her eyes landed and stayed, the way eyes did when something clicked. "Has she been here the whole time?" she asked. "Yes." "Did she see my presentation?" "She did." Sadie thought about this. She thought about it with the specific quality of concentration that Gavin had learned over 9 years meant she was running through implications and outcomes rather than feelings. The feelings would come later, he knew. She dealt with information first. Okay, she said. Okay. I'll meet her. She picked up the index cards from the podium. But I want to put my stuff away first. He waited while she gathered her materials. He looked back at Celeste, who was still at the back wall, watching them both with her hands in her coat pockets, and her face arranged into something careful and controlled that he recognized as the specific expression of a person trying very hard not to want something so obviously that it frightened the people around them. He walked back to her. She wants to meet you, he said. Something moved through Celeste's expression and was gone. Okay, she said, with the same single word and the same flat delivery his daughter had used, and he thought, not for the first time and not without complexity, that the similarities between them were not only physical. Sadie came back without the map and the cards, hands free, and walked toward them with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a 9-year-old who had decided to approach something serious seriously. She stopped in front of Celeste and looked up at her. Celeste looked down. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and Gavin stood slightly to the side and watched the two of them look at each other. His daughter and the woman who was her grandmother by biology and a stranger by every other measure, and felt something in his chest that was too large and too varied to name, and that he had no intention of trying. Hi, Sadie said. Hi, Celeste said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. You knew my grandpa Elias? Sadie said. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without preamble, as though she had considered whether small talk was useful here and concluded it was not. I did, Celeste said, a long time ago. Before you were born. Before your mom was born. Sadie processed this. Were you friends? Celeste looked at Gavin briefly, then back at Sadie. We were close, she said, for a while. Dad says it's complicated. It is. He says that about a lot of things that end up being explainable. The corner of Celeste's mouth moved slightly. This one is also explainable, she said, if you want to hear it, when you're ready. Sadie looked at her for a moment longer with the flat, unnerving assessment that was entirely her own. Did you like my presentation? She asked. I did, Celeste said. The part about water filtration was particularly good. Sadie nodded, satisfied. Most people skip that part because they think it's technical, but it's the most important part. She looked at her father. Can she come to dinner sometime? Gavin looked at his daughter. He had prepared himself for a range of responses. Confusion, resistance, quiet distress, the careful withdrawal of a child who had learned early that some arrivals came with departures. He had not prepared himself for the direct, pragmatic invitation, delivered in the same tone she used to invite her friend Jessie over to work on homework. That's up to her, he said. Sadie looked at Celeste. Do you want to come to dinner? Celeste looked back at her. Yes, she said. I'd like that. We don't eat fancy things, Sadie said. Dad makes good soup, but he only has about 6 meals he makes. 7, Gavin said. The pasta and the soup are basically the same meal. They are not. They're both noodles with stuff. Celeste laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and slightly surprised, the kind that happened before you decided whether to let it. And Sadie registered it with a small nod, as though this confirmed something she'd been assessing. I don't need fancy, Celeste said. Good, Sadie said. She picked up her backpack from the floor where she'd dropped it. Dad, can we go? I want to start the riparian zone research tonight. They left the gymnasium together, the 3 of them, and in the parking lot, Gavin unlocked the truck and Sadie got in, and Celeste stood on the pavement in the gray November cold and looked at him over the hood. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. Not harshly. Just the same instinct as before. Thank you was too small, and also, this wasn't a gift he was giving her. It was a risk he was taking. There was a difference. She nodded. Tuesday, he said. 7 o'clock. I'll text you the address. She nodded again and walked to her rental car, and Gavin got in the truck, and Sadie was already looking something up on his phone without asking, which was a conversation for another time. The weeks that followed did not go smoothly, because nothing that involved multiple people with significant histories and legitimate grievances ever went smoothly, and anyone who told you otherwise was either lying or hadn't gotten to the hard part yet. Tuesday dinner was awkward in the specific way that first dinners were awkward when everyone at the table was aware of the weight of the occasion and trying not to behave as though they were aware of it. Gavin made the soup. The one Sadie insisted was basically the same as the pasta, which it was not. And Celeste arrived at 7 exactly, which told him something about her, and she brought nothing except herself, which told him something more. Sadie monopolized the dinner conversation almost entirely with the riparian zone research, which had in 4 days expanded from a vague interest into something approaching a small thesis. And Celeste listened with genuine attention that was not performed. She asked good questions. Sadie revised her opinion of Celeste slightly upward with each one, which Gavin tracked without commenting on. After dinner, while Sadie was in the bath engaged in the nightly argument with herself about whether to wash her hair, an argument she always lost but conducted with thoroughness, Gavin and Celeste sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the awkward honesty of two people who had run out of context to hide behind. "She's remarkable," Celeste said. "She is." He looked at his coffee. "She's also 9, and she doesn't know everything yet. She knows you knew Elias. She doesn't know the rest." "I know. That conversation is going to happen," he said, "at some point, and it's going to be harder than tonight." "I know that too." "When it happens," he said, "you don't get to manage it. You don't get to come in with a prepared version of events that's been optimized for reception. She's going to ask you what happened, and you're going to tell her the truth, and she's going to react however she reacts, and you're going to sit in that." Celeste looked at him across the table. "Okay," she said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." She paused. "I'm not going to argue with you about this, Gavin. You set the terms. I agreed to them. I'm going to keep agreeing to them." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I don't have a better option, and I know it." "That's not good enough." She was quiet for a moment. "Because she deserves someone who shows up the way she deserves," she said. "And that means I don't get to do it on my terms. That's not a hardship I'm accepting reluctantly. That's just what's right." She looked at her hands on the table. "I have spent 15 years doing things on my terms. I am very good at it. I'm also sitting in a mechanic's apartment in a small town on a Tuesday night because doing things on my terms produced the worst outcome of my life." She looked up. "So?" Gavin sat with that. He didn't respond to it directly. He got up and refilled his coffee and came back to the table, and they sat in the kitchen and listened to Sadie's bath time monologue filtering through the wall, which involved a recitation of migratory bird names that she had apparently not finished processing and needed to run through one more time. "Gadwall," Sadie's voice said distantly. "Blue-winged teal, northern pintail." Celeste looked at the wall with something in her expression that was open in a way he hadn't seen it before, unguarded, present, the face of someone who had stopped managing themselves for a moment and was just sitting in a kitchen listening to a child name birds through a wall. He let her have it. The dinners continued. They became a Tuesday thing, then sometimes a Saturday, depending on Sadie's schedule and Gavin's job load, which in December picked up, because December was when people discovered their cars were not winter-ready and arrived at his shop with the surprised expression of people who had not considered that this might happen. Celeste rearranged things to stay in Delbridge longer than she'd planned. She didn't announce this. She just stayed. She and Gavin had a harder conversation in the 3rd week. He had been thinking about it since the gymnasium, since the diner, since the shop, since the mountain road. He had been thinking about it and assembling it slowly, the way he assembled anything complicated, not rushing the sequence, not presenting conclusions before he'd actually reached them. And in the 3rd week, on a Tuesday after Sadie had gone to bed, and they were again at the kitchen table, he said the thing he'd been building toward. "I need to know what you want from her," he said. "Not in general, specifically. What does it look like to you 5 years from now? What role are you trying to occupy?" Celeste looked at him steadily. "Her grandmother," she said. "What does that mean to you?" "Someone who's there," she said. "Someone she can call, someone she knows. Someone who shows up to the things that matter and is boring and present at the things that don't." She paused. "Not a benefactor. Not someone who fixes problems with money. Someone who's actually in it, in the ordinary part." "You live 6 states away," he said. "You run a company that has 300 employees and requires a significant portion of your life." "I know. That's not a manageable distance for ordinary." "I'm aware." She looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about the office situation. There are things that can be restructured. I'm not going to tell you I'm moving to Delbridge. That would be both implausible and probably the wrong thing for everyone. But I'm telling you, I'm working on the geography problem and I'm taking it seriously. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm telling you I know it exists and I'm not pretending it doesn't. He nodded slowly. One more thing, he said. Okay. At some point, he said, you are going to feel the impulse to help, financially, because that's how you're wired, and because you have the means, and because you'll see something that needs doing, and you'll know you could fix it, and the fix will seem obvious. He met her eyes. Don't. Celeste was quiet. I'm not saying this because I'm proud, he said. I'm saying it because the moment you make this about what you can provide, it becomes about your guilt and not about her. And she deserves for it to be about her. He paused. She has what she needs. We're not comfortable, but we're not struggling. If that changes, I'll handle it. What if you can't handle it? Then I'll figure something out. He looked at her. I've been figuring things out alone for 5 years. I don't need a rescue. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. He thought for a moment it was resistance, the instinct of a woman who had solved problems professionally for 2 decades, pushing back against being told her solution wasn't wanted. But it passed, and what was underneath it was something quieter and more considered. Okay, she said. I hear you. That's not the same as agreeing. I know. She paused. I'm agreeing. I'm just telling you that I heard you first because you deserve to know I actually listened. Gavin sat back in his chair. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made its periodic sound. Outside, a car went by on the street, its headlights moving across the ceiling briefly, and Gavin tracked it without meaning to. The old operational reflex, cataloging movement in the environment, diminished now to a mild background habit that showed up in moments of quiet. Tell me something about him, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out of somewhere that had been waiting for the right moment, and the moment had arrived without announcement. About Elias, something I probably don't know. Celeste looked at him with slight surprise, then looked at the table. She thought for a moment. He couldn't cook, she said. At all. Not in the usual sense of people who say they can't cook but can actually make a few things. He genuinely could not produce a meal. He made eggs once that I'm still not sure I've fully processed. She paused. But he knew the name of every constellation. He'd grown up somewhere without much light pollution, and he'd taught himself from a book when he was 12, and he never forgot it. He used to. When we'd sit outside somewhere at night, he'd just start naming them, not showing off, just saying them, like he was taking attendance. Her voice had gone quieter. Orion, Cassiopeia, Perseus. He knew the myths too. He'd tell you the myth if you asked, but he didn't push it. Gavin was quiet. He never got to do what he wanted to do, he said. No, Celeste said. He didn't. He talked about the shop for years, Gavin said. His own place. He had a name picked out. He had a location in mind. He never had enough capital, and he kept saying next year, and then next year never came. He paused. He was good at it, though. He was really good at the work. I know, Celeste said. I know he was. They sat in the kitchen with Elias between them, the man they had both loved in different ways and lost in different ways, who had spent his life fixing other people's engines and dreaming about his own place and never quite getting there, and whose daughter had spent years looking for her mother and never quite getting there either. The losses sat in the room without drama, the way old losses did when they'd been lived with long enough to become furniture. He would have been a good father, Gavin said. Celeste's jaw tightened briefly. Yes, she said. He would have. The following weeks brought December, and December brought Sadie's Christmas concert, which she was in under protest because the program involved a song she found musically undignified, and which she performed anyway with the resigned professionalism of someone who had decided to do a thing well, despite not respecting the thing. Celeste came. She sat 2 rows behind Gavin and slightly to the left, which was where Sadie had told her to sit. Sadie had, in the weeks since the gymnasium, developed a specific and entirely unsentimental set of expectations about where people sat and what they brought and how they behaved, which Gavin recognized as her way of processing something too large for direct approach. Manage the logistics, control the seating arrangement, make the strange thing ordinary by organizing it. After the concert, Sadie found both of them in the crowd and addressed them as a unit, which was new and which neither of them commented on. It was a good concert, she said, with the tone of someone clarifying a fact rather than offering an opinion. You were great, Gavin said. The song was still bad, she said, but I committed to it. She looked at Celeste. Did you think the song was bad? Celeste considered. I think your performance of it was considerably better than the song deserved. Sadie pointed at her. Exactly, she said, and walked off to find her coat. Gavin and Celeste stood in the school hallway with parents moving around them. She's going to be a lot to deal with when she's older, Celeste said. She's already a lot to deal with, Gavin said. She's been a lot to deal with since she was 4. You seem to manage. Most days. They walked out into the December cold and across the school parking lot, and Gavin watched Celeste's breath make small clouds in the cold air and thought about what he was doing, what he had been doing, incrementally and imperfectly, over the past weeks. He was not a man who acted without thinking. I was also not a man who confused thinking with certainty, having spent enough years operating in conditions where certainty was a luxury you couldn't afford. You made the best assessment you could with what you had. You stayed ready to adjust. His assessment, made over dinners and school events and kitchen conversations, and one long Sunday afternoon when Celeste had come over and Sadie had talked at her about riparian zones for 2 uninterrupted hours while Gavin worked on a carburetor in the kitchen because the apartment was small and there was nowhere else to do it. His assessment was that Celeste Armitage was doing what she had said she would do. She was showing up. She was doing it quietly and without production and without attempting to purchase anything. She sat through the difficult conversations and she told the truth about herself without flattering the telling. She made mistakes. She occasionally reached for the wrong kind of help, the financial reflex surfacing in small ways, an offer here, a suggestion there. And when he called it, she backed off without argument. She was not perfect at this. She was in fact visibly uncomfortable with how imperfect she was at it, which he found more convincing than comfort would have been. On a Sunday in late December, 3 days before Christmas, Sadie asked Gavin directly about Celeste. They were in the kitchen, Sadie at the table with her laptop doing something that was nominally homework and actually mostly research into river delta formations, and Gavin at the counter making dinner. The apartment smelled like garlic and the specific warmth of a small space with the heat running, and it was dark outside before 5 o'clock because December didn't believe in extending that courtesy. Dad, Sadie said. Yeah. Is Celeste my grandmother? He turned from the stove. She was looking at him over the laptop screen with the direct, patient expression she used when she was asking something she already half knew the answer to but wanted confirmed. That's complicated, he said. You always say that. Because things are complicated. But is she? Sadie pushed the laptop to the side and put her elbows on the table. Like biologically. Is she related to Mom? He turned the burner down and came to the table and sat across from her. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, with Marielle's eyes and Marielle's way of asking questions, and he now knew something of Celeste's precision, the tendency to want complete information before she decided what to feel about it. Yes, he said. She is. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Mom didn't know her? No. Did Mom know she existed? She was looking for her, he said. She spent a long time trying to find her. Sadie absorbed this. And Celeste was looking for Mom? Yes, but they never found each other. Another silence. Sadie looked at the table and did whatever she did when she was processing. The internal thing that had no visible indicators except the slight stillness, the momentary absence of her usual forward motion. That's really sad, she said finally, not dramatically, just as a fact, assessed and stated. Yeah, he said. It is. Does Celeste feel bad about it? Every day. Sadie looked at him. Is that why she comes to dinner? Partly, he said. But I think also she wants to know Marielle through you. And I think she wants you to know that your grandfather was a real person who existed and was loved. And I think she's trying to figure out how to be someone useful to you without overstepping. Sadie considered this with the thoroughness it deserved. She asked good questions, she said finally, about my projects. Most adults don't actually care, they just pretend. I know. She cares. I think she does. Sadie pulled the laptop back in front of her. Okay, she said, and went back to the river deltas with the finality of someone who had completed a necessary assessment and was ready to move on. Gavin went back to the stove. He stood at the counter and stirred the pot and thought about Marielle, the way he always did in the kitchen, because the kitchen had been her territory in a way that the rest of the apartment hadn't quite managed to become his in the years since she died. He thought about her, and about the box in the closet, and about the compass in the truck, and about all the ways a thing could fail to arrive in time for the people it was meant for. He thought about Elias, naming constellations in the dark. He thought about a 22-year-old woman alone in a hospital, making a decision she would spend 15 years carrying. He thought about what it meant that all of this had converged in his beat-up pickup on a rain-soaked mountain road, of all the roads in the world, of all the nights that road could have been driven and wasn't. He didn't reach for meaning. He wasn't built for that kind of reaching. But he stood at the stove, and he let the thought sit there, the way you let something sit when you didn't have anywhere to put it yet. And then Sadie said something about whether tributary systems were technically considered part of the river or separate entities depending on the classification model, and he turned around and they talked about that for a while instead. Outside, the December dark pressed against the windows, and the street below was quiet, and the compass in the truck 4 floors down turned on its thread in the cold air that came through the old rubber seal around the passenger window, slow and without direction, the way it always had. Christmas came and went the way it did in small apartments with one parent and one child, imperfectly, warmly, with too much food from Mrs. Paulette across the hall and a gift-wrapping situation that Gavin had handled at 11:30 on Christmas Eve with tape that kept losing its stick and paper that kept tearing at the wrong places. Sadie got the field guide she'd asked for, 3 of them, freshwater ecosystems, North American birds, and one on river geomorphology that Gavin had ordered specifically because she had mentioned it once in passing 6 weeks ago, and he had written it down on a receipt in his jacket pocket and found it again when he was doing laundry. She also got new colored pencils, the professional grade ones she'd been using the art store's display model to look at for 4 months without saying anything about it, because she had inherited from Marielle the inability to ask for things she considered extravagant. She cried a little when she opened the pencils, just briefly, in the way she cried, quickly, as though it had happened before she could stop it, and then collected, looking away until it passed, and then back to business. "You saw me looking at them," she said. "I did." I didn't think you noticed." "I noticed things," he said. She looked at the pencils in their case, the full set of 72 arranged in color order, and ran her finger along the tops of them. "Mom would have noticed too," she said. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." They had Christmas breakfast together, just the 2 of them. And then Mrs. Paulette came over with her daughter and her daughter's family, and the apartment got loud and full, in the way it only did a few times a year, and Sadie played with Mrs. Paulette's grandchildren with the patient, slightly formal generosity of an only child who had learned to enjoy other children in doses. And Gavin stood in the kitchen doorway with coffee and watched all of it and thought that this, the noise, the imperfection, the too many people in a small space quality of it, was what he had built. Not the plan he'd had at 25, but something real. Celeste called on Christmas afternoon. He let Sadie answer, which was new. He had not done that before, and it registered in Sadie's expression when he handed her the phone, the slight recalibration of what this meant. She took the phone and sat at the kitchen table and talked to Celeste for 11 minutes about the field guides and the pencils, and a question she had about whether certain river systems in the Pacific Northwest qualified as riparian or something else given their gradient characteristics. And Gavin washed dishes and listened to his daughter talk to her grandmother and did not try to manage what that felt like. It felt like a lot of things. He let it. January arrived with the particular ruthlessness January had in the mountains, and Gavin's shop got busy in the way that cold weather made it busy. Dead batteries, seized brakes, the perennial human surprise at what sub-freezing temperatures did to rubber and metal. He worked long days and picked Sadie up, and came home and made dinner and helped with homework. And on Tuesday evening, Celeste came, and the dinners became what they had become. Less formal now, easier, with the specific ease of people who had learned the shape of each other and were no longer working quite so hard around the edges. She was still staying in Delbridge. She had rented a short-term apartment on Heller Street, 3 blocks from the school, which she had described as functional, and which Sadie had visited once and described as sad, in a way that required immediate plant acquisition. She had brought Celeste 2 succulents from the hardware store's garden section, presenting them with the serious authority of a person performing a necessary intervention. Celeste had put them on the windowsill and watered them with the careful attention of someone who had never owned a plant and was not entirely sure what she was doing, which was, Gavin thought, watching this from the doorway, an accurate metaphor for most of what she was attempting. The hard conversation happened in February. Not the conversation he had told her to be ready for. The one where Sadie would ask her the full truth and she would have to sit in whatever reaction followed. That conversation had been coming for months, and Gavin had been waiting for Sadie to arrive at it in her own time, because Sadie always arrived at things in her own time, and attempts to manage the arrival always made it worse. It happened on a Tuesday, after dinner. Sadie had been quieter than usual all evening, which Gavin had noticed and which Celeste had noticed. He could tell she'd noticed because she'd watched Sadie with the particular attention she brought to things she was trying not to react to prematurely. Sadie waited until after the table was cleared. Then she put her elbows on the table and looked at Celeste and said, "I want to know why you didn't keep my mom." Celeste went still. Gavin stayed in his chair. He did not intervene. He did not soften the setup or provide context. He had told Celeste this would happen, and it was happening, and the only thing he could do was let it. Celeste looked at Sadie for a moment. Then she looked at the table. Then she looked back up. "I was 22 years old," she said, "and I made a decision out of fear that I have regretted every day since." She paused. "I was scared. I was poor and alone, and I told myself I was making the choice for your mom's sake, because she deserved more than I could give. But the truth is I was also scared for myself, scared that having a baby would end the life I was trying to build." She paused again. "Both of those things were true at once. That's the honest answer." Sadie was looking at her steadily. "Did you love her?" "I didn't know her," Celeste said. "She was 4 days old." "That's not what I asked." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I did. In the way you can love something you've held for 4 days that you know you're about to lose." "Yes. Then why didn't you try to find her sooner?" "Because I was ashamed," Celeste said, "and because being ashamed of something is a very effective reason to keep not doing the thing that would fix it. Every year I didn't look was another year of not having to know how much time I'd wasted." She met Sadie's eyes. "I'm not proud of that. I'm telling you because you asked for the truth, and you deserve it." Sadie looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. "My mom spent a long time looking for you," Sadie said. "I know." Celeste's voice was level, but it was costing her now, visibly. "I found that out from your dad. She really wanted to find her family." "I know." "And you were looking for her too, at the end." "Yes, but not soon enough." Sadie thought about this. She looked at the table, then at her father, then back at Celeste. "Dad says it's not useful to be angry at things you can't change," she said. "He doesn't always follow his own advice about that. But that's what he says." The corner of Gavin's mouth moved. He didn't say anything. "I'm not angry at you," Sadie said to Celeste. "I think I might be sad. But I'm not sure yet because I just found out the whole thing." She paused. "Is that okay?" Celeste looked at his daughter, 9 years old and already doing the thing that most adults never managed, which was distinguishing between what she felt and what she was supposed to feel, and giving herself permission to be still uncertain. "That's more than okay," she said quietly. "Okay," Sadie said, and got up from the table. "I'm going to draw for a while." She picked up her colored pencils from the counter where she'd left them. "You can stay if you want," she said to Celeste. "Both of you." She went to her room. The door stayed open. Gavin and Celeste sat at the kitchen table in the February quiet and didn't say anything for a while. From Sadie's room came the sound of pencils on paper, the slight scratch and movement of someone making something. "She's going to be fine," Gavin said eventually. "I know," Celeste said. "That almost makes it harder." "Yeah," he said. "It does." He understood what she meant. There was a specific difficulty in encountering a child who was managing something enormous with more grace than you had managed much smaller things, and it required a particular kind of honesty to sit with that without making it about yourself. Celeste was doing it. Imperfectly, with the slight tension in her hands that she wasn't entirely aware of, but genuinely. She stayed for another hour. When she left, Sadie came out of her room and showed her a drawing she'd done. A figure standing at the edge of a wetland, the water around them rendered in the careful blue-green that was Sadie's signature, with birds overhead that were identifiable by species if you knew your silhouettes. She'd labeled it at the bottom in her compressed handwriting, things that look still but aren't. Celeste held his drawing for a moment. "Can I keep it?" she asked. "That's why I made it," Sadie said. Spring arrived in the way mountain springs did, grudgingly, in increments, with cold mornings that lasted until almost noon before the temperature decided to cooperate. March brought mud, and then April brought mud with intermittent warmth, and by May the trees along Cartwright Street had committed to leaves, and Sadie had committed to the Riparian Zone project for next year's science fair with a ferocity that Mrs. Callahan had described in a parent conference as inspiring and also somewhat exhausting. In April, Gavin did something he had been turning over since the previous fall. He had not told anyone. He had not told Celeste, specifically, because he had been very clear with himself that this was not going to be something she enabled or funded or made easier in any financial sense, because the moment she did that, it became something different than what it needed to be. He had done it the way he had done most things in the last 5 years, quietly, on his own terms, with the specific stubbornness of a man who believed that the things you built yourself were the only ones that fully belonged to you. He had spent 8 months renegotiating the lease on the unit next to his shop, which had been sitting empty for 2 years, and which the building owner, a man named Reyes who lived above the hardware store, had been meaning to do something with and hadn't. He had spent 4 months working on the business plan in the evenings, at the kitchen table after Sadie was in bed, with a cup of coffee and the financial spreadsheets that revealed, in unambiguous numeric terms, exactly how tight his margins had been for the past 4 years, and exactly what he'd need to make this work. He had applied for a small business loan from the County Development Fund, been turned down once, revised the application with the help of a woman at the small business center 3 towns over who had the useful quality of telling him what was wrong with it rather than what was almost right, and been approved on the second attempt. He signed the lease in April. He told Sadie first. She was at the kitchen table, field guide open, pencil in hand, documenting something in a notebook she had started keeping of local bird sightings from the apartment window, which was not a view that offered extensive ornithological variety, but which she was approaching with systematic determination regardless. "I'm opening my own shop," he said. She looked up. She looked at him the way she looked at information she was deciding what to do with. "Your own shop," she repeated. "The space next to the current place. I signed the lease today. That's the one that's been empty." "Yeah. Since before we moved here." Reyes finally came around. Sadie put the pencil down. "What's it called?" He had thought about this for a long time, longer than anything else in the plan, because it was the thing that mattered most and the thing that was most possible to get wrong. He had tried several versions and discarded them all, and come back, eventually, to the one that was true. "Marielle's Way Home," he said. Sadie looked at him. Her expression was very still for a moment. Then she nodded once, slow and definite, the nod of someone ratifying something important. "That's the right name," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." He told Celeste the following Tuesday. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The lease, the loan, the timeline, the plan. And when he was done, she looked at him across the kitchen table with an expression he had learned over months to read with some accuracy. "You did this yourself," she said. "Yes." "You're telling me because you're part of this family now," he said. "And people in families tell each other things, not because they need something." He paused. "I'm not asking for help. I'm telling you it's happening." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "That's all." "Okay," she said again, and smiled, not the managed, careful expression she'd arrived with in November, but something real and slightly caught off guard, the kind of smile that happened when something landed better than you'd expected. "I do have one thing to ask," he said. She waited. "You have contacts," he said, "commercial fleet accounts, companies that need vehicle maintenance contracts." He met her eyes. "Not a handout. A referral. If there's anyone in your network looking for a reliable service contract in this region, I'd like the introduction. I'll do the rest." Celeste looked at him. "That I can do," she said. "Good." He picked up his coffee. "That's all I need." She made 3 calls in the following week. 2 of them resulted in meetings. One of the meetings became a contract, a regional logistics company that needed quarterly maintenance on a fleet of 14 vehicles, the kind of reliable recurring revenue that made a business plan go from theoretical to viable. It was a legitimate contract, negotiated on standard terms, with no preferential pricing and no special treatment. It was exactly what he'd asked for and nothing more. It was enough. Marielle's way home opened on the first Saturday in June, not with a ceremony. Gavin was not a ceremony person, but with the doors unlocked at 8 in the morning and a sign in the window and the work already on the board. Sadie had made a second sign that she installed herself, a hand-lettered thing on cardboard that she hung above the front desk without asking him, reading, "If it's broken, we fix it. If it's not broken, we'll tell you." He left it there because it was accurate. Above the front desk, on a nail he had put in himself, hung the compass. He had moved it from the truck the night before, carrying it inside with the same careful deliberateness with which he handled things that mattered, and hung it where it would be seen by anyone who came through the door. The crimson thread was faded almost to pink now, and the casing was as scratched as it had ever been, and it turned slightly in the draft from the door whenever anyone came in or out, pointing nowhere in particular and somehow, always, pointing somewhere specific. Celeste came at 10. She didn't bring anything except herself and a coffee from the corner place, and she stood in the middle of the shop and looked around at it. The organized tool racks, the clean lift, the job board with the first week's appointments already filling, the sign Sadie had made above the desk, the compass on its nail. And she didn't say anything for a long moment. "What do you think?" Sadie asked from behind the desk, where she had installed herself for the day with her field guide and her notebook, performing what she had described as an administrative function and what was primarily her not wanting to miss anything. "I think your grandfather would have liked it," Celeste said. Sadie thought about this. "The name?" she asked. "All of it," Celeste said. "The name, too." The summer that followed was not uncomplicated because nothing in the actual lives of actual people was uncomplicated, and anyone who suggested otherwise had either not been paying attention or was selling something. The shop had a difficult July when the transmission work he'd counted on for the month got delayed because the parts supplier had a warehouse fire, and for 3 weeks the cash flow looked like the kind of math problem that had no clean solution. Sadie had a rough patch in August when she went to a camp for 2 weeks in another state and hated it. Not the camp itself, which was a perfectly good ecology program, but the being away from home part, the sleeping in a bunk with strangers part, and she called Gavin on day 4 in a voice that was trying very hard to be fine and was not fine. He drove up and got her. 6 hours each way, a Tuesday he couldn't afford to lose from the shop, no hesitation. She slept the entire drive back. These were the ordinary difficulties, the ones that didn't have dramatic resolutions, that just required being present and making decisions and absorbing the cost. This was what a life was. Not the mountain road moments, not the compass in the rear view moments, but the transmission supplier and the camp phone call and the Tuesday dinners and the math homework and the water pump and the grocery run and all the 10,000 unremarkable acts that made up the actual structure of belonging to someone. Celeste understood this better than she had in November. She was not the same person she had been on that mountain road, soaking wet, with a cracked phone and a dead Range Rover and 15 years of weight pressing on her sternum. Some of that was external. She had restructured her work significantly, had promoted her COO to a position of genuine operating authority, and had pulled herself back from the daily management into something closer to strategic oversight, which she was good at and which required less of her physical presence in the company's headquarters. She flew back regularly, but the constant presence obligation was gone, and she had built something more sustainable. More of the change, though, was internal, and that was harder to describe. She had spent 15 years being very good at outcomes, at engineering results, at steering situations toward destinations she had identified in advance. She was skilled at it. It was genuinely her best quality in a professional context. And it was nearly useless in the context she found herself in now, which required something almost opposite, the ability to be in a room without driving it anywhere, to let a relationship develop at the speed it needed rather than the speed she preferred, to trust that the outcome was being built by the doing rather than by the planning. She was learning this, slowly, with the specific difficulty of someone who had not needed to learn it before because they had always had enough control over their environment to manage without it. Gavin watched her learn it. He didn't say anything about it. He just watched, the way he watched most things. Not intrusively, not continuously, but with the steady peripheral attention of a man who paid attention as a baseline state. In September, Celeste established the program she had been planning since January. She had not told Gavin about it until it was already done, because she had learned that telling him things before they were concrete gave him the opportunity to worry about her motivations, whereas done things could be assessed on their own terms. It was a foundation, small, properly structured, with a board she had recruited carefully from people she trusted and a director she had found through a network she respected. Its purpose was specific: to assist adopted individuals and biological family members in making contact when both parties had independently initiated a search, providing resources, mediation, and legal support for the navigation of closed or partial records. She called it the May Harlow Foundation, which she had decided on after a long conversation with Gavin about whether this was appropriate, a conversation that had ended with him looking at the window for a while and then saying yes. She told him about it on a Tuesday evening in September. Sadie was doing homework in her room. Gavin sat at the kitchen table and listened and then looked at her. "You're not doing this for the recognition," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "I have enough of that." "You're not doing it to feel better." She paused. "I'm doing it because I know what it costs when the search doesn't connect in time," she said. "And I have the resources to do something about that, and doing nothing about it now would be choosing, again, not to act." She looked at him. "It won't bring Marielle back. I'm not confused about that, but it might mean someone else's daughter finds what she's looking for before it's too late." Gavin was quiet for a moment. "Mariella would have thought that was worth doing," he said. "I hope so," Celeste said. "I really do." The anniversary of Marielle's death fell on the last Saturday in October. It always arrived the way it arrived. Not as a surprise, because he'd had 5 of them now, and the calendar didn't change, but with a weight that the approach didn't quite prepare you for. The actual day was always its own thing, separate from the anticipation. This year, Gavin did what he usually did in the morning. He made breakfast, he and Sadie sat at the kitchen table, and they talked about Marielle. Not solemnly, not with the careful reverence of a performed ritual, but the way they always did on this day, with the specific meandering honesty of 2 people who had loved the same person and were comparing notes. Sadie asked about things she hadn't asked before, the way she did every year, because she was a year older and there were new questions available to her. This year she asked about how Gavin and Marielle had met, which she had heard before but wanted again, and about what Marielle had been like when she was 8. Had she liked school? Had she been good at art? Had she known what she wanted to be? Gavin answered what he could and told her he didn't know what he didn't know, which was honest. In the afternoon, the 3 of them drove to the cemetery. Celeste rode in the back seat of the truck. She had been in the truck many times by now and had long since stopped noticing the compass in the rear view, or rather had reached the state of familiarity where noticing it was no longer an event. It was just there, the way it had always been there, part of the geography of the cab. The cemetery was small and on a hill and had old trees that had gone fully gold and red in October the way the trees in this part of the mountain country did, extravagantly and without apology. Marielle's stone was simple, her name, her dates, and below them, because it was what she had said once in a conversation Gavin had stored and kept, the phrase, "She showed up." Sadie read it every time she came, the way she always did, her eyes moving over the letters with the slight deliberateness of someone for whom the words still meant something new each time. They stood there for a while. The October wind moved through the gold trees, and the sky was the specific high blue of fall, the kind that had no clouds and no excuses. Celeste had been quiet since they got out of the truck. She stood slightly apart, not because she was excluded, but because she was giving herself room. The room she had learned, over months, to give herself when she was holding something that needed holding. Gavin let her be. After a while, she stepped forward and stood in front of the stone and looked at it for a long time. He didn't watch her face. That was hers. He heard her breathing change once, briefly, and then settle. She stood there for a while longer. Then she said something so quietly that the wind almost covered it. He didn't try to hear it. It wasn't for him. Sadie had been crouching near the base of the stone, looking at something in the grass. A beetle, probably, because Sadie treated any outdoor location as a potential field observation site. She stood up and brushed off her knees and looked at Celeste. She reached up and unhooked the compass from her jacket zipper, where she had been carrying it since morning. She had asked Gavin if she could bring it, and he had said yes without asking why, because he had learned that Sadie's reasons were usually worth waiting for. She held it out to Celeste. Celeste looked at it, then at Sadie. "Mom was looking for you for a long time," Sadie said, "and you were looking for her, and you both had pieces of the same thing." She looked at the compass in her palm. "I think she would have wanted you to have this." Celeste's jaw tightened. She looked at the compass for a long moment. This small, scratched, worn thing that had moved through so many hands in so many years. From Elias, to the search, to Marielle, to the rearview mirror of a mechanic's truck, to this hillside in October. She reached out and took it. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and for the first time since Gavin had known her, she stopped managing her face entirely. She just let it be what it was. After a moment, she closed her hands around it and looked at Sadie. "Your mom found her way home," Sadie said. "She's here. You should find yours too." Celeste opened her hands and looked at the compass one more time. Then carefully, she held it back out to Sadie. "Keep it," she said. "It belongs with you." Sadie looked at the compass. She looked at Celeste. She looked at her father. Then she took the compass back and held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. This thing that had been so many people's, that had traveled such a strange and specific route to end up in the hand of a 10-year-old girl in a cemetery in October. And she closed her fingers around it. "Okay," she said. She put it in her jacket pocket, and that was where it stayed. Gavin looked at his daughter, at the slight bulge in her pocket where the compass sat, and at Celeste standing with her hands at her sides in the gold October afternoon with the trees moving around them. He thought about what it had cost to get to this hillside, all three of them, in this particular configuration. He thought about what had been lost in the getting. Marielle, Elias, years that didn't come back and decisions that couldn't be unmade, and time that moved in only one direction regardless of what you needed it to do. He also thought about what was standing in front of him. Not a resolution, not the clean ending where everything broken got fixed. This was not that, and he had never been the kind of man who reached for that kind of story, because he had lived enough of an actual life to know that the real version was always messier and more specific and more hard-won than any clean version could be. What was standing in front of him was his daughter, who was going to grow up knowing where she came from, knowing her grandfather's name and the name of the woman who had loved him, knowing that her mother had looked for family with the same stubborn refusal to stop that Sadie herself brought to everything she cared about. She would grow up with the compass in her pocket and the field guides on her shelf, and the knowledge that someone who had made a terrible mistake had come back and stayed and earned something, slowly and imperfectly, the only way anything real was ever earned. What was standing in front of him was Celeste, who had stopped running from the thing she feared most and had found. On the other side of that fear, not absolution. Absolution wasn't on offer and they both knew it. But something useful, something worth doing. A foundation with Marielle's name and a windowsill with 2 succulents and a Tuesday dinner table and a 9-year-old who had given her a drawing of a figure at the edge of a wetland and called it Things That Look Still But Aren't. And Gavin himself, a 37-year-old mechanic and former Navy SEAL and single father who had rebuilt a life from the inside out, who had learned that the hardest missions were not the ones with clear enemies and clear objectives, but the ones where the only thing standing between you and collapse was the decision to keep going, every day, in the ordinary and unremarkable direction of the people you loved. He had stopped for a stranger on a mountain road in the rain because stopping was the right thing to do. He had not known what he was stopping for. He had not needed to know. He had just looked at someone who needed help and done what he was built to do. That was the thing about people who were genuinely good at something. The goodness didn't announce itself. It didn't wait for the right conditions or the right story or the right witness. It just showed up, wet and tired and nearly out of fuel, and did the work anyway. Marielle had known that. She had spent her whole life proving it, quietly, without credit, in the particular way she showed up for people in situations and her own difficult search. She had not found what she was looking for in her lifetime, but she had kept looking, and in the looking she had laid a trail that led, eventually, to this hill, to these 3 people, to a compass in a child's pocket and a shop with her name on it, and a foundation that would help someone else's daughter get there in time. She showed up, her stone said. Yes, Gavin thought. She did. Sadie slipped her hand into his, her jacket pocket pressed against his leg where the compass was, and he felt it there, that small, specific weight, scratched silver and worn soft, and pointing wherever it pointed. Celeste walked beside them. They went down the hill together, through the gold and red trees, into the ordinary afternoon that waited below, the drive home, the dinner to make, the field guide on the table, the Tuesday that would come and the Saturday after it, the shop with the sign above the desk, and the nail above the front door and the workboard filling up with all the small necessary things that kept the world running. The wind came through the trees one more time, high and cold and clean, and the three of them walked through it without stopping, toward the truck, toward the town, toward the unremarkable and irreplaceable life that was waiting for them at the bottom of the hill.